Welcome back. Just a quick few things I need to talk about. I changed my profile pic so it's no longer the meme dog. I like that picture a lot, but I needed something a bit more unique and recognizable, so I took the picture of me in my box armor and then put a nice background on it. So if you see a different profile pic, it's not a random person, it's just a new change I did. Second, there has been a large influx of viewers recently who have been watching these videos that haven't subscribed. If you happen to be one of them, consider subscribing, as it really does help me out a lot, and it'll help you keep up to date when we have a new hero analysis coming out. Now that we got that out of the way, let's get back to the topic at hand. I know I am really late talking about these new finishers, but the truth is I was thinking about just not doing this video. There are only a handful of things I have actual historical/realism commentary about, so I felt like making this video might not be necessary. But the more that I thought about it, I finally came to two conclusions. One, there are a few that I want to talk about because I already finished my analysis on that character, and I don't want to miss my opportunity to review their new content. And two, maybe someone will want to hear my thoughts on a specific hero's new finisher, even if I am just making fun of it. So I decided to make this, and hopefully this can tide everyone over until I work on Conqueror Part 3, as I'm still working hard on trying to put all the pieces together. But without further ado, let's start looking at these heroes. Also, remember, this is me being super nitpicky. Don't be upset if I call your main's finisher ridiculous. Starting off for the knights, we have Warden. His new one is called Deep Hacking. Now, if you see my analysis of Warden, you know that I have some really good things to say and some really bad things to say about him. Unfortunately, this one lies in the middle, but leaning more towards the bad. I'm not really opposed to the finisher, but at the same time, it's not very impressive, and he really swings his sword like a baseball bat in this one. Definitely not some of his better work, considering that we know that he knows how to use his sword properly for the most part. Next, we have Conqueror's one, which is called Rowdy Sentence. Now, I absolutely love finishers with voice lines to them. I just think that this game's voice lines are some of the greatest tools of immersion that really invest us into liking these characters. That being said, if the Warden here were to fall onto the shield, wouldn't his forward momentum bring the shield down flat? I mean, this shield doesn't even budge in the slightest. It makes me want to believe that Konk's shield is like Mjolnir, where no one can move it except for him, because as you can see, once he's done, he just slips it back on as if it was super easy to move. Meanwhile, the Warden can put his full body weight on it, and even more weight as his neck breaks on it, and it not even move an inch. Next, we have Lawbringer, and his one is called Cyclonic Justice, and this hands down probably has to be my favorite one. If you watch my Lawbringer analysis, you know what makes the poleaxe so versatile. This finisher makes a great example of it. He jabs with the butt spike of the weapon, then strikes with it as well, and then finishes with a sweeping chop that takes the opponent's head off. Is it flashy? Sure, a little bit. But is it outside the realm of possibility? No, I don't think so. Besides, these finishers are meant to be flashy. Regardless, a good example on using the entirety of the weapon. We're skipping Peacekeeper for now. I'll explain why once we finish the knights. Next, we have Gladiator, and his is called Wriggling Victim. So, I get it. Trident, Neptune, the enemy is a fish. It's a clever finisher, I'll give it that. But there's not much else to say about it though, although it did give me a good chuckle when I first saw it. Next, we have Centurion, and his is called Knock Yourself Out. So his is interesting, not because the enemy somehow still has the strength to throw a weak-ass punch after being impaled. His is interesting as in, he goes to chop off the arm, instead of holding it out while he cuts it with his other hand, which he definitely could have done in this situation. He instead lets go, and the enemy just keeps it held out there for him to chop. I mean, props to Larry here, that was very considerate for him to do, especially considering that keeping your arm extended like that gets pretty tiring after a while. Now imagine doing that after just being stabbed and punched. Overall, I think that this part makes it hilarious, and I'm fairly certain that they did it on purpose, knowing Yubi's type of humor. Next, we have Black Prior, and his is called Slowly But Surely. Now, this one really starts out interesting. He deflects the opponent's punch with his shield, then proceeds to use that downward momentum to put him into a position to do a rising strike with his shield. That's pretty cool, but then it gets weird after that. I guess he pins the opponent's foot to the floor with his shield. Yeah, that physics-wise makes about as much sense as the Conk and his immovable shield. And then the worst part is he does a super edgelord stab into the opponent while making weird noises that really doesn't make me fear him. It just sounds like a dog who is chewing on a chew toy. Now that we're outside the Year of the Harbingers, we hopefully won't have to deal with this edgelord stuff anymore. but they should also stray away from making more edgy stuff for BP and the other Harbingers in general, just because in my opinion, if that's the aesthetic you want to build, you have more than enough available to do so. Meanwhile, if you just want to make yourself a sane, normal sword and shield knight, you're really working with what little Yubi gives you with this character. Just my opinion though, but I know there's a lot of other people who weren't big fans of the Edge when they came out initially, and this is probably a big reason why they're moving away from it this year. Alright, let's talk about Peacekeeper. So I want to dedicate some time just to talk about her finisher, Skilled Cut, and might I just say, very skilled indeed. I'll explain why, but again, any criticisms I have aren't directed towards the aesthetics of the character. I personally think this move is very cool, but let's break down how asinine it really is. So she starts off by pulling the sword out of the target, flips it, and then catches it by its blade. Off to a strong start. She then proceeds to impale the enemy's forearm with one of the quillins of her crossguard. After that, she proceeds to stab the opponent in the back of the knee, forcing them to the ground, and then, in one swift movement, removes her crossguard from the opponent's arm, pulls back for a strike, and lobs the opponent's head off with the ricasso of the blade. Then is able to fully impale the enemy's head through the top of the skull with her dagger before the head can fall, all while not looking at it. Now before I start dunking on this finisher, I just want to start by saying whoever it was at Ubisoft that came up with this one deserves a raise. This is the most off the walls, batshit insane stuff that I have ever seen, and there is no way I could even think of this, let alone a human try to perform this. So let's start from the beginning so we can break down how insane this is. Half sorting, full sorting, basically grabbing it by the blade to perform a Mordhau, whatever you'd like to call it, has been insanely popularized after the explosion of medieval history media becoming a much more front and center market on YouTube. The thing is though, it wasn't as frequently used as it may seem. When thinking of the primary reason to use a sword by grabbing it by its blade, it's to turn your cut and thrust based weapon into a percussive weapon. Now why would you want to do that? Well, to defeat armor of course. The thing is, not a lot of people who are planning on fighting people in armor would bring a sword. The idea behind this technique is that if this was your only option, you could use this. And even then, when we look at treatises that have armored longsword combat, we see that they much preferred half swording by grabbing one hand on the blade while still controlling it by the hilt. I don't think people realize how much more uncomfortable it is to grab a weapon where it technically wasn't meant to be grabbed and then swing it around as if it was any other percussive weapon. That means feinting, parrying, and all the things that you're going to have to do in a real combat scenario is going to get a lot harder when you have to make into account, oh, hopefully I'm properly holding my sword right so I don't cut my hands. More so, the only effective, and I use that term loosely, way to use this technique is to aim for the head. Even with all the weight of the hilt shifted to the top, it's not going to have the same effect as a dedicated mace, and even if it did, it'd still be most effective to aim for the opponent's cranium. So obviously, when you see someone invert their weapon to perform a Mordhau, and you are in armor, you could basically go, oh, okay, I'll just protect my head. Because if they still try to attack your head, you could easily disarm them like shown in this treatise, because their grip on that weapon isn't going to be as strong as yours for many reasons. And if they try to go anywhere else that's well protected, you can go for their head. Another thing people seem to forget is that pommels are still that. Whether you shift their weight to the top of the weapon or leave them at the bottom, they're still big weighty knobs. So let's just say the opponent decides to make a swing for your thigh. Just close the gap between you and your opponent and ring their bell Centurion style until they yield, or they look like Ober and Martel after a fight. Now, I'm sure you could endlessly go, but what if they do this after you do that? And what if, the point I'm trying to make is that flipping your sword around is a very situational thing. So doing it at any point, just because, isn't the best thing to do. And that's not to downplay its effectiveness, I just don't want people to overplay its practicality. Now, back to the topic at hand, there technically have been quillons that sort of tapered to the tip, making it more viable to be used like a pick or something of the sort. But as you can see in the footage I have, those quillons are the exact opposite of that. They have big metal stops at each end, so I don't think they're going to be doing much penetrating. Also, I don't know how possible it would be to penetrate a forearm deep enough to manipulate an opponent's arm with just half of a crossguard. Next we have the stab to the knee. I don't really have much to say about that, but then we have the coup de grace of it all. Literally. She proceeds to cut her opponent's head off with the ricasso of her blade. Now, for those of you who don't know what a ricasso is, it's the length of blade closest to the handle or the guard, and it's usually unsharpened. When it comes to arming swords though, it's also usually the thickest part of the blade. This means that she technically not just cut her opponent's head off with the thickest part of the blade, which is already impressive, as usually a sword that is really thick tends to not cut very well at all, but she also beheaded him with it most likely unsharpened as well. This leads me to believe that this very thinly framed woman just essentially ripped the head off of a full-grown man while also holding her weapon by the end of a blade that we all know is sharp enough to lob off limbs. She then proceeds to know the location of the head falling and impale it before it hits the ground. In conclusion, I think Peacekeeper has been taken over by a demon because I don't know if anyone has that kind of inhuman power. This also concludes my Peacekeeper rant of don't flip your sword around unless you absolutely have to. Up next, we have the Viking faction, and to start us off, we have Raider with his From the Beard finisher. So this one, I think, is absolutely fantastic, just because it has hooking with the axe. Unlike most other weapons, the axe has one unique feature that I feel is very underutilized in a lot of axe hero kits, except maybe Beserker, and that's hooking with the axe. Another great thing about this finisher is that he also shoves with the top of the axe head as well. It's just overall great, and it's plausible stuff, except for the head popping off, but this is a fighting game. If heads weren't rolling all the time, I'd be disappointed. Next, we have Beserker, and his is called Dismemberment. Quite the unenthusiastic name, but his finisher is quite good in my opinion. So Beserker starts off by dodging some punches, and then ends up, like in good Beserker fashion, hooking the opponent's arm while dodging it at the same time. It looks like a really solid grapple too, and then he moves knowing that he can now manipulate his opponent's arm. Now realistically he could break it from here, but considering this game is a bit over the top, he just rips the entire damn thing off. He then just goes up to finish off the opponent, even though I'm fairly certain a guy who just lost an arm from the shoulder down isn't going to last much longer by himself anyways. Next we have Highlander, and his is called Hilted Up. I can't wait to do a Highlander analysis as I have so much to say about him. That being said, this finisher is ridiculous. To start off, he swings the sword and it stops halfway through the opponent, so he decides to turn the entire blade to where it's facing up. If your blade stops halfway through, that means it's stuck. Trying to twist it might only break the weapon off, or at the very least get it even more stuck. But he twists it so now the crossguard lines up perfectly with the opponent vertically, and then he brings the opponent's head down onto the quillin, and luckily I was using a big round bulbous quillins, because then we are supposed to believe that the Highlander has enough force to implant that crossguard into someone's head with just the rotation of their neck. Okay. Next we have Jormmungandr, and his is called Bait and Nail. I just have one question. Just one. Where did the enemy's head go? So we can't see it from the menu, but then once we go into preview, it's almost like it cut away from him. Okay, so let's look at the person dying perspective, and as you can see, no head.
So no head?
So next we have Shaman, and hers is called Sacrifice Throw. Now, I have a lot of things to say about Shaman, but I'm not going to do that here. My only question is, why did they do this one when Aramusha has literally the exact same one? I don't mind it, don't get me wrong, but if we're sharing finishes here, then I have a few suggestions that I'd want to make at some point. Next we have Valkyrie, and hers is called Shield Trip. Now, I absolutely love this one. It's not realistic per se, but it has a lot of neat things to it. For starters, the shield throw at the beginning is really nice. It's almost Captain America-like. She then proceeds to brace her spear into the ground, it looks like, and lets the enemy impale themselves onto the spear. This reminds me a lot of medieval boar hunting with spears. Now, boars are big, mean animals, and they can and will run you through if you mess with them. That being said, they aren't that bright, and if they get caught up sprinting at you, they won't stop. So people at the time came up with the solution to hunting boars, where you would plant your spear into the ground and basically the boars would run themselves through onto the spear. Boar spears would have specialized quillons to prevent the boar from sliding all the way down the shaft. Regardless, I just find this one pretty interesting because it reminds me of that. Also, the shield flip on the arm is pretty badass. Next we have Warlord, and his is called Head Carrier. So I don't have much to say about this one, but that slash he did was way too wide of a slash. But I guess if his intent was to take the enemy's head off, then I can kinda understand. But he proceeds to try and flip the enemy as if removing the head wasn't the original intent. Also, if the head was that loose, he wouldn't been able to flip the body like that, and he probably would have noticed beforehand. I know a bunch of people are going to be like, it's meant to be a joke, don't be so nitpicky. Welcome to the channel, it's what I do. Now we can move on to the samurai faction, and to start us off we have Kensei with his Osotogari finisher. This one's very interesting, but let's lay down some context first. What is an Osotogari? Well, you probably already know what it is because you might have done it before in middle school to your friends, but you just didn't know. Although, hopefully you never did it to the extent that you would have in an actual martial art. In judo, an Osotogari is basically a clothesline with a leg sweep that takes your opponent to the floor. As you can see here, this move can swiftly take someone off their feet. Now, in game, I suppose it does the same, but with the added element that it also lobs the head off of the opponent as well. There's a lot I can say trying to debate the actual physics of it and whether or not this is possible, especially with a sword like the Nadachi, but let's just keep it simple and look at what's going on at the surface level. You can see that the opponent almost reaches for Kensei's weapon, it looks like, or at the very least goes for some sort of grapple. The Kensei then engages that grapple and puts him into a position to make a takedown. Overall, this looks really solid and well made. Next up, we have Orochi, and his is called Neck Snap. So, no. Just no. First of all, when it comes to types of steel swords, the katana is on the more fragile end. This is mostly due to their differential hardening treatment that creates the Hamon line, but also makes them extremely brittle on the edge. So you wouldn't want to try and take this blade and put it around someone's neck. Also, the position he has, it would have been just much better to use his arm and ditch the blade, or by snapping his neck by rotating his head and not applying pressure directly to the neck itself. It overall just doesn't make sense, and it gives it an awkward look in my opinion. Next up we have Shinobi, and his is called Hooked on a Killing. So I don't know how I feel about this, but let's just get this out of the way. This isn't realistic at all. There's no way you could throw a kama or a kasurigama straight like that and have it hit into a target just to pull them towards you. So with that out of the way, I am a really big Scorpion fan from Mortal Kombat series, and I always wanted a Shinobi finisher that kind of incorporated Scorpion's "come here" move that could fulfill my Shiraiyu dreams. Now that we have something like that, it just feels anticlimactic. I don't know. Chalk it up with the other lackluster Shinobi finishers, I guess. Next up, we have Hitokiri, and theirs is called Butterfly Beheading. So, Hitokiri in general is not a very realistic character. I know Ubisoft wants us to believe that she uses the Ono and that she's an executioner, but Ono literally just means axe in Japanese. Also, a majority of axes in history look nothing like what the Hitokiri has. But putting all that aside for now, because this isn't a Hitokiri analysis, this move looks interesting and plausible, I guess. I like the beginning with the shove with the axe, remember when we were talking about that with Raider, but the jumping attack at the end is a bit much for me. I think it would have been a lot cooler and a lot more plausible if she'd have just done a charge top heavy and said the voice line with it. Maybe even add a bit of the orange glow with it, I don't know. Next we have Aramusha, and his is called In the Forearm. I really can't wait to do an Aramusha analysis. This character has so many interesting things that I want to talk about, but we need to stay focused on this for now. So this finisher fits the type of fighting style and personality that Aramusha has. You can see how he toys with the opponent for a bit, then finally stabs him in the arm, and then gives a head shake of disapproval, proceeds to lob off said arm, and then goes for the kill. Even gives us a little bit of a sword flourish at the end. Overall, really interesting and totally plausible, except maybe how easily he stabbed the arm. But hey, it's a video game. Next up, we have Nobushi, and hers is called Nobushi Wheel. So this, in my opinion, is very similar to all of the other Nobushi finishers, where she takes the opponent to the floor and does a quick slash to their neck. That being said, I don't know how I feel about her flipping an entire person over herself. Maybe she's been training with Lawbringer and he showed her a few tips, because that's got to be an insane amount of strength she's using right there to flip someone over herself. Imagine her doing that to Shugoki. That'd be insane. Also, the slash, she's dead ass dabbing on her opponent. You could not tell me otherwise. Show me an ancient Japanese depiction of someone doing that and tell me that it's not a dab. I'll wait. No, I won't. I'm moving on. Next up, speak of the devil, or more like Oni. It's the Shugoki. His finisher is called Samurai Senton, and we're going to play that game again. Where'd the head go? As you can see, he daces the opponent, throws them to the floor, cannonballs, and then gone. Not even a blood splatter to indicate that he was squished. It's just gone. That's a crazy magic trick, Shugoki, but you can keep that one a secret. Finally, oh god, we have the Wulin. Now, some of you may know that I don't like reviewing Wulin stuff just because, for the most part, there's a lot that some might say is impractical. But maybe it's different this time. To start off, we have Tiandi, and his is called Spiral Ending. I'm going to be honest with you, I had to watch this like 3 times before I even knew what was going on. This thing gives me whiplash just looking at it. At some point, I will do an analysis for Tiandi and why he's using the Dadao wrong, but let's just look at the Warden right here for now. No real human being would spin that hard and that fast being hit, even if they were on an ice rink with dish soap slathered everywhere for lubricant. I just don't understand why the Wulin always need to be so extra. Next up, we have Nuxia, and hers is called Coat Rack. So I think it's interesting and kind of funny too. Although I don't think anyone who just got stabbed in the neck would still be standing that long, and also, the weapon was placed with the majority of the weight facing out, so it probably would have just fallen out on its own. Besides all that though, it's fancy, it's unique to her character and her moveset, and it incorporates the use of combining both blades together, which is characteristic for them, so I heard. Next we have Zhanhu, and his is called What a Waste. Now, this is a finisher I can get behind. Really simple, but very fancy at the same time. To start, the enemy moves in for an attack, he redirects it, and then does a simple slash. The enemy's still standing, so he proceeds to do a sweeping kick, followed by a big chop to the waist area. The fluidity of this move is spot on, and it's overall a solid finisher. Next up, Shaolin, and his is called Helicopter Strike. Now, Shaolin monks are known for their use of the staff, and I'm surprised that it took them this long to produce a finisher that has the twirling helicopter look to it. Not much else to say than that, though, considering that it is a pretty short one. Last but not least, we have Jang Jun, and his new one is the Upward Guillotine. Now, I actually genuinely like this one. One thing that we seem to only see from Jiang Jun is the use of the flat of the blade to daze or just plain outright BM your opponent. There's one more thing that people don't realize. Because of the springy nature of the steel that's used for bladed weapons, hitting someone with the flat of your blade creates a reverberation that will help increase the momentum to the next strike. To double down on this point, in Joachim Meyer's treatises for longsword, he talks about a move called the Prellhau, which can basically be translated into rebound strike. In short, he uses the flex of the blade to basically slingshot him into the next attack. Now, the practicality of this concept is contentious to say the least, but here in video game world, I want more realistic yet ridiculousness added in. Let me troll people by hitting them with the flat of the blade, damn it. I'm getting sidetracked. The rest of this finisher is somewhat realistic for the most part, even up to the end. If I end up playing Jiang Jun for a long period of time, I might end up getting this. Oh, but it's not over yet, Snake! We have 4 more finishers to go now that we have the battle pass. Let's start in the order that it drops in. To start off, we have knights, and theirs is called Clarent in reference to King Arthur's sword. So because I can't speak of the handing or use of conjured weapons, I'm just going to make the assumption based off of their physical counterparts. In this one, just like half of Warden's finishers, they swing the longsword like it's a bat. It's just a shame, really, to see an opportunity go to waste, because I can promise you, if I had to make a finisher based off of longsword, I could come up with choreography that looks good and is completely unique compared to the other factions. You don't need to make longsword users look like they've never fought a day in their life with all the information that is available about medieval combat nowadays. Next up, we have the samurai, and it's called... oh god, hold on, I can do this. Futsunomitama. This sword is based off of a legend of a personified sword, and I think that this one is fantastic in my opinion. It begins with a first slash to the torso and then finishes by a second slash to the head, which then takes the head off of the opponent. Simple yet elegant, and although the footwork is a little bit off, it really doesn't detract from how much more believable this is compared to the knights. Someday, the knights will win something for once. Someday. Next, we have the Vikings, and theirs is called Dainsleif, I believe it's pronounced, and it's based off of the mythical Viking sword of King Hogni, where once it's drawn, it cannot be sheathed until it has killed. So, I understand that in this game, they really want to nail home the savagery of the Vikings, but we all know that the Vikings weren't savages for the most part. They might have been brutal in combat, but who wasn't? That being said, the way they wildly swing their weapons around could possibly be forgiven when looking at the roster themselves. Like, this finisher fits the likes of Shaman and Beserker. You can't tell me that Clarent looks right on any of the knights. Well, I mean, you could, but I would just disagree with you. And lastly, we have the Wulin with their finisher called the Gujian or Jiaojian, depending on your pronunciation. Now, this one is absolutely fantastic. While all the other swords are named after swords of legends and myths, this sword is actually real. I knew about this beforehand, but I never knew the name until now. Its name is literally the Sword of Gujian. This sword is known for its impeccably well-kept quality, even though the sword itself is dated back to either 700 BC to 400 BC. That means that this sword could be older than the Roman Republic, not the Empire, the Republic, over 2,000 years ago. Think about that. Now, the moves on this finisher are a little flashy and whatever, and although it's a little plausible, it's not really yada yada yada. Let's talk more about the sword. Now, I love swords. If you've seen me with the rest of my channel, you'll know that that's one thing I love talking about. I really should have become an archaeologist if it weren't for the fact that I'm not the sharpest crayon in the tool shed. But back to the point, their rendition of this sword is pretty spot on, considering that they probably didn't expect anyone to pause, see this, and inspect every detail. But no one ever expects me, so here we are. The first and foremost thing is the blade's details, and again, I'm going to cut them some slack for making an asset that most people will only look at for a second or so at most. That being said, they nailed the blade pattern, at least enough for me to immediately recognize it. Now, the in-game model looks to almost have a scale-like pattern, while the real-life version almost has more of a diamond pattern, but the fact that both create an almost chain-link fence design is fascinating. Also, it might be because the magical essence of the sword might be messing with the colors. It appears to have more of a two-tone effect when the real blade actually has an all-bronze look to it. I'm only stating this as there is reproductions of this sword that give it a darker hue, most likely to accentuate the pattern more. Now, the guard it has is a bit large compared to the original. It also has some things on the sides of each edge. I can't make out what it is, and unfortunately, since I don't own these finishers yet, I can't look at it through NVIDIA Ansel like I do for a lot of my panning shots. Besides the ornament part, the guard itself looks pretty good, although a little thick and not exactly replicating the original. The grip itself seems to be pretty similar to the original, and the pommel is very large compared to the original. The original had much more of a flat disc pommel, while this one is large enough to mimic the guard's patterns. Overall, this is the tier that I'm most hyped for in the Battle Pass. I am so ready to put this on all of my Wulin heroes, especially Nuxia, because I think she has the best one, especially with the voice lines. I don't know what she says, but she says it with power, and I like that. Alright, that's going to be the end of this video. If you liked it, leaving a like would be much appreciated, and if you like videos like this, then subscribing would be your best bet to keeping up with the next videos. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or translations for what Nuxia is saying, go ahead and leave it down below. Other than that, I will hopefully have Conqueror Part 3 out sometime soon, and I hope you guys have a great day. Peace.